They weren't good, and deep down, you knew it. So why couldn't you stop watching them? These were the superhero shows that looked wrong, felt cheap, and barely made sense, yet somehow stayed stuck in your head for years. This isn't just nostalgia, it's something stranger. Because what if the reason they failed is exactly why they work, and once you see it, you won't watch them the same way again? The New Adventures of He-Man, 1990. It didn't feel like He-Man anymore. And that discomfort is exactly where it starts working. The moment the setting shifts from Eternia to space, something breaks. Familiar armor looks different. Characters feel rewritten. Even the tone, once mythic and grounded, turns strangely futuristic and distant. At the time, fans rejected it. It wasn't what they signed up for. But here's what's easy to miss. That disconnect creates curiosity. Because instead of repeating the same formula, the show accidentally becomes an alternate version of itself. A what-if scenario that feels almost experimental. Skeletor navigating technology instead of magic. He-Man operating in a world that doesn't fully belong to him. It feels off. And that off feeling keeps you watching. Because your brain is trying to reconcile two versions of the same reality. The one you remember and the one you're seeing now. And that tension becomes the hook. It's not comfort viewing anymore. It's curiosity viewing. You're not watching because it's perfect. You're watching because something doesn't align, and you need to understand why. Black Star, 1981. It looks familiar, almost too familiar. I'd like something you've seen before, even if you haven't. Black Star arrives with a glowing sword, a lone hero, and a mystical world that feels strangely repetitive. Animation loops recycle, movements repeat. Entire sequences feel reused. At first it feels cheap, but then something shifts. That repetition starts to feel intentional, predictable in a way that becomes comforting, like a rhythm your brain starts recognizing before it even happens. You know the beats, you expect the outcome, and instead of resisting it, you settle into it. That's where it becomes effective, because the show isn't pulling you forward with excitement, it's pulling you in with familiarity, a loop you don't have to think about, a world that doesn't challenge you, it absorbs you. And here's the deeper layer. This formula didn't fail, it evolved. How what feels basic here becomes the blueprint for something bigger later, which means you're not just watching a show, you're watching the early version of a system that would dominate an entire decade. And once you realize that, it stops feeling small. Space Sentinels, 1983, it repeats itself again and again and again. And somehow, that's what makes it hard to look away. 3 heroes, same structure, identical transformations. Every episode unfolds with almost mechanical precision. Nothing surprises you. Nothing changes. At first, it feels like a flaw, but then your brain adjusts. Because once you recognize the pattern, the show becomes something else entirely. Not a story, but a routine. A sequence your mind starts anticipating before it happens. You know when the transformation begins, and you know how the conflict resolves. And that predictability creates control. You're no longer reacting. You're syncing. That's the hidden hook. It turns passive watching into something almost interactive. Not through complexity, but through repetition. And the more it repeats, the more familiar it feels, until it stops being boring and starts being strangely satisfying. Because in a world where most shows demand attention, this one removes effort completely. You don't watch it for surprises. You watch it because you already know what's coming, and that certainty keeps you there longer than it should. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, 1980. It moves slower than you expect. And that silence changes everything. This isn't fast-paced action. It's something quieter. Almost too quiet. Tarzan isn't written like a typical hero here. He doesn't rush. He observes. Reacts minimally. The jungle itself feels still, like time isn't moving the way it should. At first, it feels uneventful. But then that stillness starts pulling you in. Because instead of overwhelming you with action, the show creates space. Space to notice details. Space to feel the environment. The repetition of movement, the calm pacing, the minimal dialogue. It all builds a rhythm that feels almost hypnotic. And that's where it becomes effective. It doesn't try to excite you. It lowers your guard instead. until you're watching without realizing how long you've been watching. That's the trick. It disguises itself as simple, but functions like atmosphere. And once you settle into that atmosphere, leaving feels harder than staying, because nothing is demanding your attention, but everything is holding it. Of the Freedom Force, 1980. It looks like a superhero team, but feels like something else entirely. The structure is there, heroes, missions, conflicts, but the energy doesn't match expectations. Everything feels slower, more controlled, almost restrained. At first, it feels like it's missing something, but then the tone reveals itself. This isn't chaos-driven storytelling. It's structured, deliberate, almost instructional. Each character, Hercules, Sinbad, Merlin, moves with purpose, not urgency. And that changes how you watch it. Instead of reacting to action, you start observing patterns, roles, archetypes. It becomes less about excitement and more about understanding how each piece fits together. That's the hidden appeal. It feels different from everything around it. Not louder, not faster, just more contained. And that containment creates clarity. You always know who's doing what, why it's happening, where it's going. And that clarity becomes comfortable. Because in a decade filled with noise, this show moves with control. And sometimes, control is more engaging than chaos. Defenders of the Earth, 1986. It should feel consistent, but it never quite does. And that instability becomes its strongest weapon. On paper, everything works. Flash Gordon, the Phantom, Mandrake, a team built for something epic. But the tone keeps shifting. One moment it's serious. The next, it feels exaggerated. Then suddenly, it leans into something almost unintentionally funny. At first, that inconsistency feels like a flaw. But then it becomes unpredictable because you can't settle into a pattern. You don't know what version of the show you're about to get, and that uncertainty keeps your attention locked. You're not watching comfortably, you're watching carefully, trying to anticipate the next shift. And that's the hook. It replaces stability with tension, not narrative tension, but tonal tension. The kind that makes every scene feel slightly off balance. And when something feels off, your brain stays engaged because it's trying to correct it. But it never fully can. RoboForce, 1984. It doesn't try to hide what it is, and that honesty changes everything the longer you watch. From the very first frame, RoboForce feels less like a traditional show and more like something engineered for attention. Bright colors, bold designs, and characters that seem built to be remembered rather than understood. At first, it feels shallow. The conflicts are simple, the dialogue is direct, and the world doesn't ask much from you. But then something shifts. You start noticing the commitment. Every visual choice is deliberate. Every movement is exaggerated just enough to leave an impression. There's no hesitation in what it's trying to be. And that lack of hesitation becomes its strength. Because instead of pretending to be deeper than it is, RoboForce leans fully into spectacle. It embraces the artificial. It celebrates the visual over the narrative. And that full commitment creates a strange kind of authenticity. You're not watching it for complexity. You're watching it because it understands exactly what it is, and delivers it without compromise. That confidence makes it stick, because even when the story fades, the imagery doesn't. The colors, the shapes, and the motion, they stay in your mind longer than the plot ever could. And that's the twist. What seemed empty at first was actually focused. Not on story, but on impact. And impact, when done right, lasts longer than meaning. The Mighty Hercules, 80s syndication era. It feels older than everything around it, and that contrast quietly pulls you in. The moment it begins, you can sense the difference. The animation is limited. Movements repeat. Scenes feel stripped down to their simplest form, almost as if something is missing. At first, it feels outdated, like you're watching something that doesn't belong in the same space as the louder, faster shows of the decade. But then the tone shifts, not on screen, but in how you experience it. Because once you adjust to the simplicity, you start noticing what's not there. There's no overload, or no visual clutter, no constant demand for attention. And that absence creates something rare: focus. You're not dividing your attention between multiple elements. You're following a single line, clearly and calmly, and that clarity makes it easier to stay engaged. But the deeper hook comes from something even less obvious: the rhythm, the pacing, the voice. Everything feels consistent in a way modern content rarely achieves. There are no sudden shifts, no unexpected spikes, just a steady, reliable flow. And that reliability becomes comforting because nothing surprises you. And in a world where everything competes for your attention, that lack of surprise becomes its own kind of pull. You don't watch it because it excites you. You watch it because it doesn't. And sometimes that's exactly what keeps you from leaving. Super Friends, early 80s seasons. It looks like the biggest superhero show imaginable, but it moves in a way you don't expect. With characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, everything suggests scale. You expect intensity, fast-paced action, high-stakes conflict, but what you actually get feels controlled, slower, almost guided. At first, that feels limiting. The conflicts resolve quickly. The dialogue explains everything directly. The pacing doesn't rush. It leads. And that difference creates distance between expectation and reality. But then something changes. Because that simplicity isn't a limitation, it's a design. Everything is structured for clarity. Nothing is hidden. Nothing requires effort to understand. And that clarity makes it accessible in a way more complex shows aren't. You don't need to focus fully, or you don't need to analyze. You just follow, and that ease becomes the hook. Because when something is easy to watch, it becomes easy to stay with. The show removes friction. It doesn't challenge you. It guides you, step by step, scene by scene, and before you realize it, you're still watching. Not because it overwhelmed you, but because it never did. That's the hidden strength. It trades intensity for consistency, and consistency, when done right, keeps you longer than excitement ever could. Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, 1981. It feels like it should fall apart, but it never quite does. Bringing together Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar introduces complexity from the start. Different powers, different personalities, multiple dynamics moving at once. It should feel chaotic, overloaded, hard to follow, but instead it stays controlled, carefully balanced, and that balance becomes its defining feature. At first it feels toned down. Conflicts are simplified. Villains don't overwhelm the structure. Even when things escalate, they never spiral out of control. But that restraint creates something unexpected. Smoothness. Every scene transitions cleanly into the next. Every moment feels connected. There's no confusion, no disruption, and that uninterrupted flow becomes addictive. Because your brain doesn't have to pause. It doesn't have to catch up. It just continues. Following the rhythm without resistance. That's the real hook. Not excitement, but continuity. The show removes friction between moments, and when there's no friction, there's no reason to stop. You don't feel the urge to leave, because nothing is pushing you out. Instead, it pulls you forward gently, scene by scene, line by line, until watching becomes effortless, and effortless viewing is the hardest thing to walk away from. Thundar the Barbarian, 80s rerun era. It shouldn't make sense, and yet it does in a way that's hard to explain. The world is broken, a shattered earth filled with magic, science, mutants, and ruins that don't belong together. On paper, it feels chaotic, disconnected, almost random. At first glance, it looks like too many ideas forced into one space, but then something unexpected happens. The chaos starts forming patterns, because even though the elements are strange, they follow a consistent internal logic. The rules may be unusual, but they don't change. And that consistency is what makes the impossible feel believable. You stop questioning the combinations. You stop analyzing how it works, and instead, you accept it. That acceptance is the turning point, because once your brain stops resisting, it starts engaging. The world no longer feels broken. It feels complete. Not realistic, but stable. And stability, even in chaos, creates immersion. That's the hidden strength. It doesn't ask you to understand everything. It asks you to trust the system. And once you do, the experience changes. What once felt messy starts to feel intentional, and what felt random becomes something you want to explore further, because the deeper you go, the more it holds together. And that's what keeps you watching. Captain Planet and the Planeteers, 1989. It says everything out loud. And somehow, that's exactly why it refuses to be ignored. From the very first moment, there's no ambiguity, no layered subtext, no hidden meaning waiting to be discovered later. The message is clear, direct, and almost impossible to miss. The villains aren't complex. They're exaggerated, symbolic, and instantly recognizable. The solutions don't unfold gradually. They arrive quickly, delivered with certainty. At first, it feels overwhelming, almost too obvious, like the show isn't giving you space to think for yourself, like it's pushing its message harder than necessary. But then something shifts, because that lack of subtlety starts to work in its favor. Nothing slips past you. Every idea is repeated, reinforced, and anchored into your memory. You don't need to analyze it. You don't need to interpret it. You just absorb it. And that absorption creates something stronger than complexity ever could. Clarity, that's where the real power sits. While more layered shows fade over time because they require effort to recall, this one stays intact. The colors remain vivid. The characters feel instantly familiar. Even the phrases echo long after the episode ends. Because repetition doesn't just communicate, it imprints. And that imprint becomes the reason it lasts. It doesn't rely on nuance, it relies on emphasis. It doesn't try to impress you in the moment, it ensures you remember it later. And that's the twist most people miss. What feels excessive at first becomes effective over time. Because in the end, the shows you remember aren't always the smartest ones. They're the ones that made sure you couldn't forget them. Some of these shows weren't polished, some didn't make sense, and some felt completely off even back then. But that's exactly why they stayed with us. Because perfection fades, but strange stick. If this brought back memories, hit like, share it, and subscribe. Because the next list might uncover something you forgot, but never really left.